This morning to commence our session this morning. So I first would like to welcome everyone to our session here of our conference. So before we begin, I'd like to invite our sister from Guyana and our sister from Suriname to bring blessings to our meeting. Please stand.
Morocco, Morocco, I would like to bring you greetings on behalf of my beloved land, Guyana, Guyanese people, also the 9 tribes or nations of our indigenous peoples from region 1 to 9. Morocco, Morocco, meaning in my Lokono language, good morning. And I hope that today is the last day of our sessions that we're having, and that what we have learned here and build that relationship with my fellow Caribbean brothers and sisters, our Garifuna, our culture, our language, that today is not only left as today, but as elders of our homeland, elders of our people, that this is just the beginning, so that we may continue, not only for us, but also for our generation, so that we can pass on what we have learned, what we have experienced to the younger generation. This I bring you, my heartfelt greetings from the bottom of our beloved Guyana. Thank you very much.
Ya sakarkong uwa patosang paporo karinya ero nono kupo. Kemando rapa na ero me kaye o wanye ero karinya orang ero konferensita yupa kenasang tamushi patone kenasang na orang irombo kaye o wanye paporo ero ponokong ka makong tamushi patone ka makong. Good morning, everyone. The word tamushi means our creator, and the word uwak potosang means elders. So, Kamando Rapa, it's a good day again. It's a blessing from our Creator that we are here to talk about ourselves and the way we should go forward. So, as an elder, in this process, I see myself with the experience of more than 30 years, focusing on indigenous peoples and women's rights. I'm one of the elders in that process. So I'm calling upon everyone that we continue the process of the way forward for us and our next generation. And I ask for blessing that we do the right thing as the Creator points out to us. So blessed day, and bless to everyone in their effort to do what we have to do. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a seat, please. So just a few housekeeping matters. We will be starting our session today. This is our final session at midday, 12 o'clock, we will have a brief closing ceremony, which will bring our conference to an end. This afternoon at 1 o'clock, the workshop on the Garifuna language will be carried out at the Peace Memorial Hall from 1 to 3 p.m. You're all invited to participate, and it will be facilitated by Dr. Gwen Nunes Gonzalez of Belize. We have had a very important and exciting time here in this conference, and the significance of having our sisters and brothers from Suriname and Guyana, as well as our brothers and sisters from Belize and Dominica, underscores the Caribbean nature of indigenous people and the link that connects us from north to south. So I feel that we have been very fortunate. There's a wonderful movement that we are engaged in, and we encourage all persons here in St. Vincent and the Grenadines to join with us in this process as the Garifuna Heritage Foundation continues its work. I now turn you over to the chairman and moderator for today, Mr. Ronnie Daniel. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everyone, and let me say it's a pleasure to be here. I wasn't able to be here physically yesterday, but I did take in some of the presentations online, and of course they, as always, have been and are enriching. I am Ronnie Daniel, and of the Open Campus, and I will be it's a pleasure to be your moderator this morning for this first session. We would have two sessions this morning. The first would be session 5, and we are looking at the theme Reviving the Garifuna and Kalinago Culture, Teaching Garifuna History. Later on, we'll have session 6, our final session for the morning, looking at some of the more practical aspects of retrieval. It's a pleasure, therefore, to introduce our panel for this morning. First, we have Dr. Fraser, who is our first presenter. Dr. Fraser really needs no introduction. He is one of our local historians and a former head of the Open Campus, which means he was my boss at one point. Dr. Fraser has had a long history of engaging our, mostly our pre-independence history, from conquest right up, and his special interest has been in the area of the Garifuna, of course, he has researched the Kalinago and Garifuna in St. Vincent, and in his latest book, he has documented, again, another aspect of that history. In his book, Villain to National Hero, Châteauguay and the Early Struggle for the Independence of St. Vincent, you remain, which was launched last year. And so he remains interested in the struggles of the Garifuna and Kalinago people, and particularly those who remain after 1797. The other thing you need to note about Dr. Fraser is that he's part of a team of historians who would do a very important work, document a very comprehensive history of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. The other historians being Dr. Arnold Thomas, who is at the head table, Dr. Gary Denny, and Dr. Cleve Scott, whom you met earlier this week. My only concern is that you didn't have the feminine presence in that team. Nonetheless, we'll see how that goes. But I say that to say, please welcome Dr. Fraser. Before he comes, I want to also introduce our speakers for the second session after Dr. Fraser. Niall Finneran, Dr. Finneran, who you met earlier this week, is a reader in historical archaeology and heritage at the University of Winchester. He holds a PhD in Ethiopian archaeology from the University of Cambridge and has directed archaeological and heritage work in the Americas, Africa, Asia, and Europe. And Dr. Finneran is also a fellow of the Society of Antiquaries of London and the Royal Archaeological Institute. And he has been crisscrossing the seas of the Caribbean since 2003 or 2003. Dr. Finneran. And his colleague, Dr. Christina Welsh, lectures in religious studies at the University of Winchester, the UK, where she also runs an online master's degree in death, religion, and culture. And this is an interdisciplinary scholar, or she is rather, an interdisciplinary scholar. And she has research interests in indigenous lifeways, community heritage, and education, and has published widely in these intersections, religion and culture, etc. For the past 3 years, she has been working with her colleague, Dr. Finneran, on research projects in London, Barbados, and St. Vincent. Dr. Christina Welsh. Okay, it's my pleasure now to, before we do that though, I have strict orders to remind our presenters that we are, because we want to give our audience some time, I was asked to remind you that you should present for 10 minutes and leave the rest to engage our audience. So 10 minutes per presenter, so that we'll have sufficient time to engage our students, our teachers, and our visitors. All right, so Dr. Fraser, please welcome him.
Good morning. I'm just hearing about this 10 minutes, and I'm not sure I could fit into that based on how I prepared my presentation. My topic is exploring our rich history. And I make the point, first of all, that the history of St. Vincent and the Grenadines and some of the smaller West Indian countries is still under-researched and subsumed in general histories of the Caribbean. That means that some things that are outstanding or even unique about our history is lost in the process. Now, this paper was supposed to have followed Dr. Michael Denny, who unfortunately is not here because of restrictions due to the coronavirus crisis. His paper was entitled Writing a General History of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, a Necessary and Timely Intervention. I was going to use this as a point of departure, but will instead just make a brief reference to the abstract of his presentation. And he makes 4 points. He argues that the knowledge of the past is fundamental for every society that asks itself, how did we come to be here? Then he suggested that colonial control of the writing of Vincentian history gave legitimacy to the idea of colonial rule itself. Thirdly, a scientific and empiricist approach to the Vincentian people, he suggests, are as worthy of study as those of any other people through time and space. And finally, he recognizes the urgencies of allowing Vincentians to engage the specificities of their own history as a framework for making sense of the present. Now, as I do this brief tour of our history, those are some of the ideas that will guide my presentation. I will touch on a few things that are unique and outstanding, and that might even help to refine Caribbean history. But I'm particularly driven by the idea of Vincentians engaging the specificities of their own history in order to make sense of the present. I'm not a going to be able to go into any details, but simply to try to expose us to aspects of our rich history and to allow us to ask ourselves, how did we get here? For me, Vincentian history is a history of struggle and resistance. And I'm going to focus on this. Vincentians today are regarded as a calm and peaceful people, unwilling to fight for their rights. But our history sends a different message. I'm going occasionally to use the word Carib for linguistic convenience, and especially in situations where I'm referring to both groups, the Garifuna and the Kalinago groups. Let me first look at the Garifuna history. Until recently, many people were unaware that they are descendants of the indigenous people living in St. Vincent. They were more familiar with Dominica, particularly because of the existence of the Carib village, now called the Kalinago village. This means that after 1797, when most of the indigenous people were banished, the attention turned to Central America, with the result that the history of those who remain here in St. Vincent is largely untold. In 1992, the quincentenary of the arrival of Columbus, the indigenous groups of the Americas began to pay more attention to researching and revisiting their history. In a publication put out by the Extramural Department of the University of the West Indies, entitled Caribbean Quincentennial, one of the chapters by Hilary Beckles dealt with the Kalinago resistance to European colonization. Only passing reference was made to the Garifuna, and this was in an article by Joseph Palacio, who is himself a Garifuna. As late as 2004, a volume by Hilary Beckles and Vereen Shepherd entitled Liberties Lost, Caribbean Indigenous Societies and Slave Systems, that is used in West Indian schools, captioned its first chapter, Indigenous Caribbean People. The focus was on the Kalinagos, with little reference to the later struggle that lasted to 1796. In fact, in that volume, Chatelier was referred to as chief of the Kalinagos. What happened in St. Vincent stands out, not necessarily in influencing interpretations of that period, but in helping to refine the story itself. St. Vincent was one of the last countries to have come under European control in 1763. Many of the others had been colonized since the 1620s. The Treaty of Madrid of 1748 had declared as neutral islands Tobago, St. Lucia, St. Vincent, and Dominica. But in 1763, when all of those islands were put under European control, only Tobago and St. Vincent had not been previously occupied by European colonizers. The story of the resistance of the Garifuna for 34 years against a power occupying part of their land and attempting to gain total control is one of the outstanding stories of Caribbean resistance to European control and colonialism. Kirby and Martin's Rise and Fall of the Black Caribs was published in 1972, and in 1973 we had an article by Bernard Marshall at the University of the West Indies entitled The Black Caribs, Native Resistance to British Penetration into the Windward Side of St. Vincent, 1763 to 1733. This helped to highlight the Black Caribs, although not unfortunately, but it ended before the final battle that led to the banishment of the Garifuna and Kalinago people. Michael Creighton, who was based at the University of Waterloo, and I know he was the supervisor of the leader of the opposition, Dr. Goodwin Friday, he went further and recognized their struggle as a fundamental part of the resistance and struggle of the Caribbean people. So now we are having this integrated into Caribbean history. In two books, Testing the Chains, 1982, and Empire, Enslavement, and Freedom in the Caribbean, he began to promote the struggle of the Kalinago and Garifuna people in an era he described as resistance in the age of revolution. The role of Chatier was highlighted. Now, following the banishment of the overwhelming number of Garifuna and Kalinago people, the struggle of the Vincentian people continued. There were occasional raids on plantations and individual cases of murder. We had the part owner of Mount William Estate being murdered by Caribs in 1798. And in 1799, a private of the 4th West Indian Regiment was killed by Caribs. This is after the banishment of most of the Garifuna. The authorities were never sure about the numbers who remained in their settlements. But in 1804, the government took control of the lands which were formerly held by the Caribs and made a grant to some Caribs who had surrendered at Mont Ronde. Now, after this, things calmed a bit, and the focus then shifted to the African slaves. In 1833, while the British Parliament was debating the Slavery Abolition Bill, one of its members, Mr. Bernal, informed the House that a state of resistance was being displayed by slaves in St. Vincent. This was happening on some of the estates, particularly in the Carib country, where slaves were deliberately turning out late to work and reporting sick in unusual numbers, sometimes as many as 40 or 50. They also warned the planters that if any punishment was administered, they were going to take their case to the governor. Now, Mr. Bernal in Parliament tried to play this off, stating that it was a result of the news of the debate, and suggested that these people who were going to be freed were already talking about having white wives and keeping their pigs and horses. But the reality was that the planters in St. Vincent were concerned about this act of insubordination that they had not experienced before. But even more, the successful revolt in Haiti made planters throughout the Caribbean fear that that example, that what happened there would set an example. So that when you had revolts in Barbados in 1816, in Berbice in 1823, and in Guyana, in Jamaica in 1831, that created some concern. Now, moving quickly, during the apprenticeship period, 1834 to 1838, we had something which is very interesting in the history of St. Vincent, and that is the role of the colored people. The colored people felt that now that the slaves were going to be emancipated, they would lose some of their status. So there was a lot of tension, and at one stage, 2 persons were found guilty and ordered to pay a fine and to have 10 days hard labor on the treadmill. Now they resented this, and they felt that the treadmill was something reserved for the apprentices, not for them coloreds who were trying to move into the ranks of the whites. The next day, the Chief Justice ordered them released on a technicality, and you had the mob going about the town created quite a lot of confusion. And just quickly, I wanted to mention, because just to look at this issue of coloreds, in 1855, a colored woman, Madeleine Grant, was arrested and convicted for stealing sugarcane. A mob of colored people invaded the courts and held the prosecution and witnesses hostage. There were only 8 police available, and they tried to get persons to volunteer, but not many of the colored people volunteered. Military assistance was sought from Barbados, but at stake was the question about the very administration of the laws, because John Hazel, who was colored, was an assistant judge of the Supreme Court, and he's alleged to have said that if Madeleine Grant was captured, he would join the rebellion. The years from 1838 to 1850, there was a lot of tension. As the slaves left the plantations, there were questions of wages, conditions of work, withdrawal of allowances, and this resulted in a major riot or rebellion in 1862, starting at Montbentic but spreading to quite a number of other estates, even as far as Evesham. The 1862 riots were major ones, but persons who have done West Indian history would have heard about the 1865 Moran Bay Rebellion. Now, what happened in 1865 was that in all of the islands, but particularly in Jamaica, the freed blacks were beginning to own land, and that there was fear that they would control the assembly. And the white planters feared that. So, not long after 1865, the colonies, with the exception of Barbados, began to surrender the rights they had formerly cherished to the governor, introducing what was called Crown Colony government. But again, to point out the importance of St. Vincent, where a lot of things are subsumed in general history of the Caribbean, St. Vincent had already set the trend, because in 1862, after the riots, the governor had stated that there was a considerable portion of the assembly who would rather rest power in the governor than allow the blacks to take control of the community. And again, this is very important, but we do not hear very much about this. But St. Vincent had developed a reputation of lawlessness, although in actuality, what it was is that the people were struggling for their rights and for better conditions. And in 1888, and I probably would not be able to say much about King Jaja, when he arrived, they refused to allow him to disembark on a Saturday because the town was virtually littered with market people who wanted to go and greet Jaja. So they invited him, they allowed him to land on the Sunday, and even then, a number of people went there to greet him. But it is interesting that when the governor was asked why he did not allow Jaja to land on Saturday, he referred to this terrible reputation that St. Vincent had for lawlessness. And again, I'm going to go through this quickly. The people were prepared to protest and to riot for just about anything. The Carnival riots of 1879, where the government had suppressed Carnival since 1872. In 1879, they could take it no longer, and they decided to defy the authorities, and there was mass-scale rioting in 1879. A military ship was invited from Barbados, but again, the people, even when the ship arrived, the people congregated and continued their righteous behavior. Going on quickly, 1885, and I'm showing the different areas in which people were protesting. In 1885, there was a protest against a federation of the Windward Islands, where, interestingly enough, the people who were foremost in this were women. And when a public meeting was called, they protested, interrupted with cries of no confederation. They wanted no federation. And eventually the decision was made not to proceed with the proposal. 1891, again, when they tried to have a common chief justice for the Windward Islands, which was St. Lucia, Grenada, and St. Vincent, the people felt that it was an attempt to introduce a federation of the Windward Islands, and again, you had protests where people stoned the governor and stoned the chief of police. When the governor eventually arrived, he was met at the wharf by a number of women and boys who accompanied him where he was going, shouting, no confederation, and wanted no confederation. And again, because of the limitations of time, one of the things I'm not able to do is the important role that women played in slave society and even after slavery, because they took a leading role in a lot of these things. Again, cricket. In St. Vincent, cricket was very popular in the villages and on the estates. And in fact, in 1900, one of our Vincentians, Charlie Augustus Olivier, was selected on the West Indian team to visit England. On his departure, the jetty was thronged with spectators who provided him with money and a letter congratulating him. He stayed on in England and played for Derbyshire and remained there until his death in 1947. And I'm just mentioning this to say that even in cricket, the people were prepared to protest. And I'll come to that in a while. But just to make the point that C.L.R. James, who we associate with the Haitian Toussaint Louverture and the Haitian Revolution, he was one who I consider the dean of cricket writing. And he referred to Charles Augustus Olivier as the best batsman the West Indies had ever produced. So Vincentians loved their games, and when a Windward Island match was played in St. Vincent in 1912, the people were angered by certain decisions which went against both teams. But when one of their favorite persons, who was actually a brother of Charles Augustus Olivier, when he was given out, unfairly they thought, they ran onto the field, breaking through the ropes. The Grenadian team and umpires had to leave the field, and after they were trying to go and people recognized the umpire, they started stoning, and to the extent that things got completely out of hand, and the umpire was rescued by the postmaster general who lived nearby, who took him into his home. The people stuck around, and even when he was taking him back to the hotel, they continued their protests and stayed around the hotel shouting obscenities. And I'm just doing all of this to show the whole attitude of Vincent. They were not prepared to stand nonsense. They were prepared to fight for whatever they want. And the final one I want to mention is the 1935 riots. The worldwide economic depression of the 1920s began to affect the colonies in the 1930s, and there were a series of demonstrations from 1935 to 1938. The first demonstration was actually in St. Kitts in January 1935, followed by St. Vincent in October 1935. I have elsewhere stated that the St. Vincent riots had not been given the type of in-depth analysis and treatment. It has been lumped together with the other demonstrations. But what was unique about St. Vincent, that while the other demonstration took place on the plantations, or in the case of Trinidad, in the oil fields, in St. Vincent, it occurred at the seat, virtually, of government, which is at the Legislative Council. And when the Legislative Council was meeting to discuss some unpopular tax measures, the people congregated in the courtyard, things got out of hand, and you had the start of riots, which moved from there to North River Road, to Cane Garden, and to Georgetown, and on the following day, continued in Camden Park. What is important about these riots too is that it led to the emergence of George McIntosh. And McIntosh was able to turn, because the people, McIntosh was charged for felony. They felt that something like riots could not be started by the ordinary people. There had to be a mastermind behind it. So they singled out George McIntosh. And when at the trial, the case was dismissed, they lifted McIntosh on their shoulders and took him out. McIntosh realized there was a vacuum. He started his own organization, the St. Vincent Working Men's Association, which dominated the legislature from 1937 to 1951. I just want to mention that McIntosh was outstanding, pushing the concerns of the working people, and in particular, he was the one who led the fight to have the Shaker religion, which again I'm not going to be able to touch on. In 1912, they had banned the Shaker religion because what we now call the spiritual Baptists, They had banned it because they considered it relics of African primitivism. McIntosh fought strongly and stubbornly for them. In fact, they were not allowed to have meetings in Kingstown. And when I was growing up, I saw these Shaker huts in the villages in very remote areas and couldn't figure out what was happening, only to realize later that they had to do that because they were not allowed in the towns. McIntosh allowed them to go to have a meeting in his yard in Paul's Lot, defying the authorities, and he was a member of the legislature. So quickly, I've tried to show that the struggles of the Vincentian people manifested itself in riots and disturbances, but I want to make the final point that there were other instances where before there were riots or disturbances, the government was forced to take action. And such one I want to just mention quickly was towards the end of the 19th century, when with the failure of the sugar industry and the virtual collapse of the sugar industry, the West Indian Royal Commission had recommended that governments introduce land settlement schemes. Fear in St. Vincent that people were going to riot led the St. Vincent government to introduce the first government-sponsored land settlement scheme in St. Vincent. Sugar collapsed, and the two crops which became important were sea island cotton and arrowroot, which were important until the 1950s. What was important too about sea island cotton and arrowroot was that they were crops which were produced by the peasants. Unlike the other islands where sugar still dominated, although not as strong as before, and the plantations took hold of this. But in the case of St. Vincent, from about 1904, 1905, the peasants became extremely important in exporting sea island cotton and arrowroot. And let me just mention too, because many people might not be aware of this, the University of the West Indies Open Campus. At the University of the West Indies Open Campus, there's an aqueduct, which was one of the remains from the cotton factory that was established in 1904. The ruins are still there. In fact, on that site, that is where the cotton factory was. And I know that with the rebuilding of the university campus, that there's an effort to restore the aqueduct and to do something in terms of publicizing. One of the problems we have in St. Vincent is that we have not paid very much attention to our old relics, our homes, our houses, and so on. A lot of the machines and the factories are virtually covered over in bush. So we have lost part of our history, but not being able to look at these things and to try to make sense of it. So it is good that the University of the West Indies is trying at least to reassemble or to restore the aqueduct so that an important part of our history would be remembered, because sea island cotton was very important, and at one stage, throughout the world, sea island cotton and arrowroot were associated with St. Vincent. In fact, Owea, which was producing arrowroot, was highly acclaimed and known throughout the world because of the arrowroot. So finally, just to say that, I mean, I've gone through this very quickly, but there are so many important areas of the history of St. Vincent, or so many important aspects of the history of St. Vincent, that are not part of a history of the Caribbean that we really need to pay attention to, because it means something to us in terms of understanding ourselves, of understanding where we are, or how we got here, and being able to identify it and to look at our whole image. So my topic was exploring our rich history, and I've tried to do that very quickly. It's more than 10 minutes, but I must apologize for that. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Fraser, for tracing our history. I know we had to rush you, but I think what is important, though, is the theme coming out of his presentation. The main argument is that we've always had a history of struggle and resistance, and that has continued even into the post-emancipation, post-independence period. I think during our discussion period, you'll have an opportunity to engage Doc on some of the things that he mentioned. But I think it's important to just mention that the main argument is that the history of struggle has always been there from the time of conquest and coming up to the present moment. It's now my pleasure to invite both Dr. Finneran and Dr. Welsh to make their presentation, after which we will have a moment of engaging our presenters on anything that they said today and previous to now. Okay, please welcome them.
Thank you very much. And Adrian, we'll talk archaeology at some point, I think. Yeah, that'd be good. Thank you again all for inviting us, and it's wonderful to be back. Over the last few years, I've been an external examiner at the University of the West Indies Cave Hill campus over there in the history and heritage sector, and I've sort of talked extensively with a number of my colleagues in the sector here. And a number of years ago, Barbados made the decision in the light of sort of financial circumstances about student grants and the teaching of history at university level, and a focusing on STEM subjects. And as I alluded yesterday to the sort of issue that the world would be a poorer place if we solely concentrated on things that we perceived to be more valuable, i.e. science. So history, heritage, it's all vital. These are important skills. And what we're going to explore here is moving a step, if you like, down into the secondary sector and thinking about how we can enrich teaching there. Last summer, I was having a chat with Christina and Lennox Honeychurch, who some of you guys will know there, and Lennox is the author of a number of Caribbean history textbooks. And we made the point to Lennox, and Lennox took it well, that this is a one-size-fits-all approach to Caribbean history. And when we started working here with the GHF back in 2018, one of the first persons we talked to was Mrs. Decima Hamilton, and we were talking to Decima in her role as in a National Trust role, but actually Decima, as you know, has a very, very keen interest in teaching and enriching the curriculum. And she suggested to us that we undertake, under the aegis of the Garifuna Heritage Foundation and also the Ministry of Education, a Teachers' Training Day, which we did in 2018, in September 2018, at the fish market down here in Kingstown, an absolutely filthy day when it was raining solidly, and it was amazing the turnout we had there. And what we decided to do that day was to make it a fun approach to rethink how you can teach history using heritage, because we're not historians. We come from a background of archaeology and religious studies which intersects with heritage, which are the things tangible and intangible that mean things to communities globally. And we thought that if you could introduce some of these ideas into the curriculum, it would help enrich, it would help hook more students into history. And that has important socio-economic implications too, as Christina will explore here. And this notion of introducing criticality, critical thinking. The world has never needed critical thinking more than it does right now. Yeah, it's opening people's minds and things like that. So I'll hand you over to my colleague Christina, who will outline how we went about doing this training.
Okay, so obviously education is considered a driver out of poverty. And in 2005, St Vincent and the Grenadines, which I'm just going to summarise as SVG throughout this, otherwise it just sounds too long, introduced universal secondary education in 2005 with an aim to improve critical thinking skills in pupils. Critical thinking is a key component, obviously, of history as a subject area, yet many students can find it dry and out of touch with their everyday lived reality, and that's not just the case here, it's also the case all around the world. History can be quite dull and boring for some students. What was particularly noticeable, though, and we were having this conversation, was that actually St Vincent is doubly marginalised because it's one of 14 territories that's covered in the syllabus, and the syllabus also doesn't mention the Garifuna, although the Kalinago and Caribs are part of a core theme. So in this presentation, which is based on a request by Mrs Gums Dyer, Senior Education Officer for the Curriculum Development in the Government, we are hoping to inspire ways that can challenge and lead opportunities for teachers and students through the co-creation of resources. And what we're hoping is that we can help students gain vital critical thinking skills and also assist teachers to ensure the sustainability of Garifuna history and heritage within the secondary school system. So secondary school education came in St Vincent in 2005, and a 2015 report noticed that it was still a challenge to improve critical thinking skills, and this was needed to be done to enhance learning outcomes. Critical thinking skills has been defined by Peter Facconi, who's a PhD and American researcher, on this slide. So as the purposeful, self-regulatory judgment which results in interpretation, analysis, evaluation and inference, as well as the explanation of evidential, conceptual, methodological, criteriological or contextual considerations upon which that judgment is based. And critical thinking can be developed through the educational study of history. But studies have shown for it to be successful, it requires teachers to be critically reflexive in their teaching praxis, and for them to encourage students to think independently and creatively while motivating them to engage with a subject that I've said very often students find quite dry and boring because it's so unrelated to their everyday life. Now, in 2009, Carl Savage, who's a historian and American school teacher, explored how to do this best by comparing a range of in-class activities with high school students in Michigan. He found that students who did tests, quizzes and assignments as part of an inquiry-led teaching approach gained a deeper and more meaningful understanding of history than students whose lectures were just lecture-based. However, inquiry-led teaching isn't particularly usual in the Caribbean across the board, and it does require a change in teaching pedagogy, which is the method and practice of teaching. So in order to facilitate a pedagogical change, ongoing teacher training would be needed. Critical reflexive practice in teaching has been an important part of ongoing teacher training in North America and Northern Europe since the 1980s. However, in St Vincent, not all of the public secondary school teachers are professionally trained via teacher training degrees, and thus they can lack, I'm not saying they do, they can lack the necessary knowledges and competencies to move into inquiry-led teaching in a classroom. Trained teachers, through continual professional development, seem to be more able to deal effectively with facilitating students to think independently and creatively, and by thinking creatively and independently, develop students' critical thinking skills, which actually is part of the Education Act 2006, Section 3. So in 2012, St Vincent government statistics noted that only 17% of public secondary school teachers were graduates. And a 2015 survey for the Borgen Project, which is a non-profit organisation aiming to eradicate poverty, noted that 58% of SVG public secondary school teachers had no educational qualifications. Now, this is a potential concern if critical thinking is going to be foregrounded in history lessons. So educationalists, Professors Chris Hubbard and Joe Pearce, argued in 2012 that good quality teaching is imperative if students are to develop strong critical thinking skills. An educational researcher and school teacher, Andrew Pollard, argues that good quality teaching includes reflexivity by teachers themselves. However, what counts as good quality teaching is not necessarily achieved through initial teacher training, and a study was carried out by Mildred Jones of the Barbados Examination Council in 1997 in Barbados, and that study indicated there was no difference in pedagogy between trained and untrained teachers. But Barbados, as with SVG, has what's known as a dominant behaviourist, teacher-centric pedagogy, which tends to encourage top-down instruction. In everyday language, this means that teachers are largely understood as depositors of knowledge and students as passive depositories. Students just listen to what they're told, take that on board. So established is this teacher-centric method of classroom practice that in 2016 a project carried out by Dr. James Godwin into public primary school education in St Vincent and the Grenadines found that traditional teaching methods remained prevalent even when teachers were exposed to much more student-centred pedagogies. There is then a major challenge in incorporating critical thinking into secondary school history classes in SVG, because recent research strongly suggests that there is resistance to bringing in student-centred forms of learning. And as such, teachers themselves will need to be fully supported in this process. A review into literature on teaching practice in developing countries, conducted by Dr. Jo Westbrook and her colleagues in 2013, can be summarised thus. There was one key attitude, three key strategies that teachers had, which fed into 6 key practices that helped support student learning in the classroom. There were also 4 main barriers and 1 major hurdle that hampered teachers. So we're going to take each of these areas before exploring the barriers and hurdles that can be overcome through an engagement in Vincentian history and particularly Garifuna heritage. Now, it's important to note here that we're not suggesting that Vincentian history and Garifuna heritage be a major part of history teaching, because actually that would take away students from the knowledge they need to pass their exams. And clearly, you need to pass your exams. But we believe the incorporation of occasional classes using student-centred teaching practice based around dedicated materials related to Vincentian history, such as Dr. Fraser was talking about, and Garifuna heritage, can help history students develop the critical thinking skills they need for today's world and to keep them engaged in the subject that currently has little relevance to them. So a literature review conducted by Westbrook et al. Found that teachers have positive attitude toward their own training, what's known as continued professional development, and having a positive attitude towards their students was found to help enact the 3 key strategies needed for more student-centred learning in the classroom. And another study has shown that this student-centred learning was found to develop critical thinking skills in students. So strategy 1 was that teachers providing feedback and inclusive attention in the classroom to their students. And 6 practices unpacked that a little more. We'll move on to that in a minute. Strategy 2 was that teachers provide a safe environment where their students can learn without fear of corporal punishment or any threat of violence. Strategy 3 was ensuring that teachers were able to draw on their students' backgrounds to make the subject content relevant in class and accessible. And in SVG, this can be a problem because of the paucity of material on the country currently in the Caribbean curriculum, but we'll return to that when we look at the barriers. So this one attitude and 3 key strategies were found to enable teachers to bring 6 practices into their teaching practice, which enabled a more student-centric approach to learning. This approach, Westbrook et al. Found, not only increased students' engagement in the subject area and thus increased classroom attendance, but gave positive educational outcomes, including increased exam results. Practice 1. Teachers using pair and group work in classes, which enabled students to discuss what they're learning with their peers and thus deepen their knowledge in the subject area. And this moved them from passive receivers of imparted information to active learners, ensuring that they were engaged in the material. Practice 2 was teachers going beyond textbook learning materials. Now, this is a major problem because, as already been noted, there is little in the educational curriculum on St Vincent and the Grenadines. So that's clearly a hurdle that needs to be overcome. Practice 3 is that teachers use a variety of open and closed questions in class, and they wait for students to answer their questions. Now, this can relate to group or pair work, but it largely depends on teachers being confident enough to engage with students, but also students developing the appropriate communication skills to engage with their teachers. Student-centric learning is not an easy option. Practice 4, teachers planning sessions to be varied in approach. Now, this might mean that some teacher-centric learning, as well as some of the more student-centric approaches, could be brought together. So not just working with textbooks, but using YouTube clips, visual imageries, items of material culture. Practice 5, teachers having strong subject knowledge, so they're able to explain clearly their subject to the students. And as the Barbados study has shown, teachers who were trained had no better classroom outcomes than teachers who were not professionally trained. So having a passion for the subject is crucial. Teachers spending time developing their own knowledge. Practice 6, teachers using local codes and local language. So not using words that students can't understand without explaining them, but recognising the meaning that words can change over time. In effect, teachers need to keep up with the kids. There's no point using language that students are not understanding. Now, of course, all of this is well and good, but it's possibly a tad idealistic, particularly if teachers are not supported. And so it's important to note the barriers and hurdles that teachers face when considering a change in classroom praxis. So the shift from traditional teacher-centric to more student-centric approaches isn't easy, and there are some difficulties. So, first barrier, teachers not having sufficient peer support and the wider support to implement changes in their classroom practice. This means teachers need to be trained themselves and to fully understand what's happening with this pedagogical shift and to be confident in the new approaches that they would bring to a classroom. Having a group of students share their feelings honestly, engaging in the discussions that they're facing, passing on good practice can all help make sure that a school is on board with any change. Barrier 2. Teachers are typically trained themselves using the traditional direct teacher-centric model, and this can be a real problem if they're trying to change their practice. So effectively, teachers need to experience the student-centric model in order to understand it. Teachers need to become students themselves in order to learn how to teach in a different way. Barrier 3, teachers not having appropriate curriculum knowledge is a real problem. Obviously they do in terms of what's exams, but not necessarily in terms of St Vincent history. And not having an understanding of St Vincent history and not having that in a curriculum can give students a real sense of disengagement. Worse, many teachers won't necessarily have a background themselves in St Vincent history or Garifuna lifeways, so they too are trying to learn as they go along. And that can be really difficult when a lot of the books are quite dense. Journal articles are really quite heavy going. We know because we have to write them that way. Barrier 4, teachers can lack support from the wider community, parents, carers, and also other staff in the education system. Although here in SVG, obviously Mrs. Uldia Gums-Dyer is fully supportive, which is why she's asked us to do this. But the major hurdle, as already noted, is that teachers lack the learning materials they need. And this is where we switch from talking to challenges to talking for opportunities. So a core theme of the history syllabus is Indigenous people from, quote, the coming of the Indigenous Americans to 1985, close quote. And the Kalinago Caribs are specifically mentioned, although it isn't clear if the Kalinago Caribs are differentiated from the Garifuna. It's just not clear in the syllabus. But as the Garifuna are black Caribs, if we can bandy that term around, then why not include them as part of the curriculum? Why let a term break things down? So there's a huge opportunity here for engaging local students to produce materials themselves. So a rationale would provide definite opportunities in shifting classroom sessions from traditional teacher-centric to more interactive, student-focused syllabus, where they can raise questions, formulate hypotheses, gather evidence from a variety of data sources, collate and interpret information themselves, make their own judgments, draw conclusions, and become critical thinkers. Now, Westborough can all note that actually it's difficult to do this. For students, it will be difficult, and it is going to need this change in practice. Next slide. This means that hard-pressed, time-poor teachers will need to be provided with subject materials from which they can teach and engage students in new and exciting ways. And this means that as well as supporting teachers to gain confidence and develop student-focused classes, there needs to be a decolonisation of material that's out there, because some of this material isn't easy for adults to access, let alone for school children. But as we said, there's some really good opportunities here, and worksheets might be a really useful one. So we're proposing the scaffolding implementation of St Vincent and the Grenadines specific worksheets for teachers to use alongside developing their own pedagogy through journaling, so they can write down how they feel about this process. The worksheets would need to be diverse in content so they can engage a range of students, and initially probably would need to be provided to teachers by experts such as Dr. Fraser. But over time, they could start developing their own worksheets and even draw on the experiences of their student. The worksheets could be flexible enough to use with the whole class or with small groups or pairs. Students can work together on a set task. They can develop their own questions. And as we've already said, they can use imagery or material culture. So as you can see, there's a list of things that history students need to do to effectively answer their question. I'm not going to go through all of these because you can actually get these later on. But heritage is really important here. And this is where the heritage part of the presentation comes in. Because while St Vincent, the Grenadines and the Garifuna history can be found in books and journal articles, this heritage is something that really needs developing from the community up. And we've been working, as you might have noticed from yesterday, on developing community heritage programmes and trying to reflect on these. So I'm just going to hand over briefly to Niall to talk through a little bit, very briefly, about how heritage can help, hopefully, a shift to change if that's what teachers require.
This is stuff that even in the UK people aren't getting to grips with. History in the United Kingdom is still stuck really within textbooks. It's still stuck within dates, personalities. History in the United Kingdom, we're a diverse country in the UK, but history is still focused very much on white experience in the UK. And it's only recently with historians such as David Olusoga and TV programmes, books like Black Britons, that we're getting a sense of the diverse heritage that's in the UK. So we've got to move forward too in our history teaching. And we've got to make it more exciting, we've got to make it more relevant. But the point being, if you know, we've got economic implications to think of here. Tourism, education tourism, developing ideas here that means a sustainable approach. And that's really, really important, sustainability going forward. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Finneran and Dr. Welch, for your presentations and for sharing the findings of your work so far with us, and to remind us that heritage can be a catalyst for teaching history in our system. What we want to do now, though, is to invite any questions for the panelists, anything that they may have said that you need clarification on, or if you want them to expand a little bit on something that they may have said. This is a chance to do that. So we have another half an hour to do that. We close around 5 to 11. So please, this is a moment to engage Dr. Fraser on his presentation and generally on the history of and the theme of this conference, and also Dr. Welsh and Dr. Finneran. So the floor is open up, please. Sure?
That some blacks were shipwrecked into the Grenadines and had children with the indigenous people. And so you had the black carriage of the Garifuna. But he was disputing that theory. He was saying what happened is that you had an African presence here in the forces from Africa, the Malian kingdom, came to our shores. And there's where the black presence came. What are you coming from?
No, I've read, as most people have done, Van Sotima's The Came Before Columbus. But when you look at it critically, and you have to ask yourself a number of questions. There were two expeditions leaving Mali. Nobody returned. So they know nothing at all about that. What they have done is to look at artifacts and a number of things in the not only in the Caribbean, but particularly in South America, and conclude that they came from these expeditions from Mali. But one has to ask a number of questions. Why St. Vincent? And if they came at that time in St. Vincent, who did they meet? Because when we look at the history of St. Vincent, we look at people beginning to identify the presence of blacks. And in fact, I can't remember the date now when they were aware of blacks in St. Vincent. So that theory by Van Sotimer leaves a lot to be questioned. It does not mean that there might not have been an African presence, but I'm questioning the issue of St. Vincent. Why St. Vincent? Why didn't you find the Garifuna presence in some of the other islands? You know, and so I have looked carefully at Van Sotimer's thing and tried to relate it to St. Vincent and have extreme difficulty seeing that as the origin of the Garifuna here. They mention the ship, and the dates are questionable. I stick to 1635, some people say 1675. But apart from that, the majority of the Garifuna came about because of the cohabitation between escaped slaves and the indigenous people. And there's a history of escaped slaves coming to St. Vincent. In fact, when you look at a lot of the treaties that were made between the Europeans and the Garifuna, they were always talking about returning runaways because it was an important it's an important issue to them that a number of these people, particularly from Barbados and from Martinique too, were coming to St. Vincent and cohabitating with the indigenous people. So I'm aware of that issue of Van Sotimer, but looking at St. Vincent, and I've done careful research in that, and I have difficulty seeing that as the origin of the Garifuna in St. Vincent. That would be my response to that.
Is Brother Ferguson? Yes. Okay.
I want to respond to what you said just it's a big issue now. Because when it comes to history and how the different approaches to history. So you're looking at history now anthropologically, ethnologically, now evidence. Before Columbus and America Vespucci, because we're talking after them post-Columbian. America was isolated, was an isolated continent. Now, history is interested in origin genesis, where things come from, who first. And what has happened with a lot of things with even black people, I just get a problem with it, is that we just put ourselves out the picture because, to answer your question, Africa is the oldest inhabitable continent. Right now, with DNA and physics and monosphere, is the Out Africa theory. They had man like in the 50s, 70s when they write, people refuse the PhD thesis. He said the Africa, origin civilization and humanity, we have to be Africanists. Getting to your question, going certain more, one of the oldest civilizations prior to the Aztecs and the Incas, Olmecs. They have proved well it had African influence, Negroid influence. So that is not answering your question in a way, but the people that are meeting is Native American who came across the Bering Strait. So that's why again, and to talk about the Bering Strait, we have to look at history now, geological history. That's why history is very problematic. It has different approaches.
Okay, thank you. Brother Ferguson, I see Sister Clap Palmer, and I see my sister Debatni. So Clap, and then Brother Anders. So Clap Palmer, my dear sister, and Anders. Is there a roving mic because we're broadcasting, so the quality of the sound may diminish if we don't have a mic. Could you get close to mic, if you don't mind at all? There are two on this side. So I say that too so the others could even come closer, please, to the broadcast quality. Thank you.
Oh, you have to keep pressing it. This one. Okay, I'd like to say thank you up front to the pair, Dr. Finneran and Welch, because the oral history toolkit, I believe that is the way forward for us to continue to engage from the bottom up. Because what happens as every wave, because as a person who lived through the Black Power days and all of that, things begin, the discourse begins, we point to certain ways forward, and then it gets sidetracked into a zone where ordinary people are left out. And there's where we lose it all the time. We lose it every single time. Waves, these things happen in waves. Right now, this exercise is in year number 7. Spiritually, 7 is a number of completion. We need to get to 8. 8 has to be something different. We've got to move this out of this setting. Academic papers presented and so forth, and staying there and discussing among ourselves alone, and it has to get to the street. When we did the referendum in St. Vincent and the Grenadines to do with constitutional reform, it was very well done in terms of getting the discussion out onto the different the bottom of the people then. Yes, and even going abroad to diaspora communities of Vincentians to talk about what we think about the fact that we want to change the constitution and so forth and so forth. Has anybody written about that? This is a very significant thing, you know, because Vincentian people said, no, we don't want, and Dr. Fraser alluded to some of this. People have their own intellectual ideas. We in academia and in the upper classes and the middle classes like to think that people are not intellectual. This is not true. Every human being is intellectual. Every human being is a thinker, created by God with freedom of will, freedom of choice to choose. And we want to forget about that. People voted against the referendum. We should examine why. See? then the whole business about that view, okay, that our history, we keep behaving as if our history began with slavery. It's just like people, I heard it in this forum, okay? People want to shelve the militancy of believers across the ages, Jesus Christ followers across the ages. People want to shelve that all the project is in these islands is white colonialist tool. That is not true. That is not true.
Okay.
Organized religion has two sets of things in it. Organized Christianity, as a matter of fact, didn't even start in Europe. It started in the Middle East with black people, with dark people, right? They were Christians. There's been Christian communities in Ethiopia, in Sudan. Forever, Nubians were Christians. Some of the slaves that they brought here were already Christians. I submit. Yes. So we and followers, serious followers of Jesus Christ himself, right? Then the other thing to do with the ship. I was speaking to some people who deal with ships and sail and so on, trained in the Royal Navy and whatnot. And he says that that's a perfectly plausible something, because if you set sail in certain types of boat, the trades will take you straight to St. Vincent, but you won't be able to get back the same way. So we can give credit for the Danes and the Vikings and whoever to sail out from wherever and discover places before Columbus. But we have difficulty thinking that we could have sailed out from Africa to discover places.
Okay, thank you. Speech, I think? Gonzalo, sorry.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I wanted to say thank you to Dr. Fraser, Dr. Finneran, and Dr. Welsh. As someone who has been a teacher in St. Vincent and also a curriculum officer, I'm very interested in teacher training. I think teacher training and...
Yes, it's on. We're hearing you.
Okay. I think helping teachers, giving them additional support is very important. And I think there's more that the ministry can do in terms of forming subject panels for history teachers and all the other subjects. But I was wondering what you all thought about having a specific module at the Teachers College for teachers. Not necessarily only history teachers, but a permanent module that all teachers should have to take. That does speak about Vincentian history, about Garifuna. And I just wanted to get your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Okay, so we'll take Dr. Martin, and then we'll ask the panel to respond. Yes, sorry, Angus. Yes.
My question, that is a problem throughout the region in terms of the curriculum and local history. I encountered the same problem in Grenada. And my thing is there a problem with the CXC curriculum? That there's a dominance of the larger islands? Because I know we talk about Maroons in Jamaica, but nobody talks about Maroons in Grenada or St. Vincent or Dominica. You know, so I think there is that. Most people you would hear talk about Maroons in Jamaica, but they have no idea about the local situation. And to me, that's not cool. You know, that people do not know the history of their island, but they know. I think we need to figure out a way to how best, work this. And I know there's a lot to cover for the CXC. I totally get, that there's this real huge amount of stuff to cover. But I know, for example, they don't cover maybe Federal Rebellion, but they cover the Grenada Revolution. So you end up picking and choosing these different pieces that I think really you end up having gaps in people's knowledge, local knowledge. Because, I'm teaching students at SGU, St. George's University, And I'm talking to them, and they look at me like if they're foreign, we all are foreign to each other. They have no idea what even their grandparents experience. And I think it's a real problem when we talk about heritage and culture, in the Caribbean, passing that on to the next generation when we don't teach it in school. And they look at me and they're like, don't blame us, they didn't teach us.
Okay. Before we take the other set of questions, I know Mrs. Saunders Mosa wants to say something, but could we just ask the panel to respond to the host of questions, and then we'll take Sister Saunders and Vanessa, and I have a comment as well, and Dr. Thomas has a comment. Yes? Oh, sorry, I know what their sister has. And okay. The panel, please. Dr. Fraser, Dr. Welsh, Dr. Finneran.
Okay. It's fun, fantastic. Yeah, I completely agree, and it's not just a problem in the Caribbean. Actually, teacher training is a really big issue, and in England at the moment, or in Britain at the moment, what's happened is teachers used to be trained all the time to be teachers. That's being dropped now, and teachers are put straight into school and expected to learn on the job. And so you're right, there needs to be support for teachers. There needs to be a module to help them develop not just their local knowledge, whichever island that is, and inter-island knowledge so that they can see it holistically, but actually to help teachers learn to be brave enough to change classroom practice, because it's difficult. We're teachers ourselves, and it isn't easy to step out of that box and do something in a new way. And you young people can actually be really quite intimidating to us old folk. When you start challenging, it can be quite difficult. And so we need to have the skills to be able to deal with that and to go, actually, do you know what? We might be wrong. You might be right. Let's explore this. So it is needed, and I think it's needed at both levels, support and also in terms of the curriculum.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Welsh. Dr. Finneran, Dr. Fraser? Yeah?
No, just to the point you're making about the larger islands, the focus is on the larger islands, and the issue of the Maroons is a very important one. That is what has driven what I talk about. It's a very important, because so much of our history is lost in that process. So I quite agree with the position you're taking on that.
Yeah, I agree, Angus. I mean, we've got such a wonderful patchwork of different things going on here and different narratives. And it's been a real learning curve for me over the last since I first came out here in 1994 with a very sort of fixed English idea of what Caribbean history was, and how through my engagement here and seeing the nuances and trying to understand and trying to communicate that back to my students back in Winchester as well. I teach the only module on Caribbean archaeology in the UK, basically, at Winchester, and Caribbean archaeology and heritage. And my students, one of my former students, and I'd love to give her a name check because of the work she's doing, Laura Hamden. Laura did an MA with me on my Cultural Heritage Management module. Laura's half Barbadian. Laura now works for Historic England's Black and Minority Ethnic Heritage Outreach Unit, which is a dedicated unit within Historic England that is now focusing in on things like walking tours around Brixton, yeah, and investigating the long history of the Caribbean and a black Englishness that goes back way before Windrush, back into the Roman period. So these are exciting times.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Thomas, and then we'll ask Sister Mosa, Saunders Mosa to yeah.
First, let me say that I am very honored to be part of the group that's been commissioned by the government to do the history of St. Vincent. And my good friend Adrian, I've known quite a while. We get along quite well, and we are the ones who have been commissioned to, let me paraphrase, deconstruct, reconstruct, and renew our history. And that is a massive, massive task. All four of us have been talking about that. And it's a lot of things that we have to throw out and bring in. That's my first point. My second point is I want to take up two things that Dr. Fraser mentioned. One question here is, how did we get here? and the second one is about protest. First of all, if you don't mind, I'm going to tell you a little story.
Keep
And
it short.
if you heard it before, I crave your indulgence. This is a boat story. It goes like this. In November 1865, a ship left India with over 500 Indians bound for St. Vincent and Grenada. On board, there was a pregnant lady. On the 4th of January, 1866, a child was born. On the 20th of January, 1866, that boat called the Countess of Ripon wrecked off Barbados, in Skeets Bay, if you know Barbados, wrecked off Skeets Bay. And the story goes, I'll shorten it, that there was a black lady from an estate, her name was Sarah Maynard, who saw the child being brought ashore and breastfed it, and according to the stipendiary magistrate, that probably saved the child's life. Okay? So, anyway, there were no deaths, one boat on the ship, and St. Vincent got its share of Indians from that one. That is how we got here. And I want to say that I am a person of Indian origin, and I got here because of the genocide and what was done to the Garifuna people. It was after genocide and the expulsion, or whatever we want to call it these days. Then the Africans were brought in, and after the end of slavery, the Indians were brought in. And just to wrap up this part of it, I can tell you more about that child who was saved by Sarah Maynard, because that person happened to be my maternal grandfather. And that I found out from my own research and in the archives and other places. Okay? So I know what coming ashore and being rescued is all about. My second point is about protests, and what I want to mention here is that there have been a lot of protests, and a lot of these protests have not been written about by a lot of people who have done the history of the Caribbean. And one of them I want to mention very briefly is what happened on the 7th of October 1882. The Indians who were working on Argyle Estate, which is now the Argyle International Airport, things were going very, very bad for them. A lot of them had come here hoping that after indenture they would go back to India. In fact, they were promised a return passage to India. Things went bad. They were being sick. They were not being looked after. And eventually they decided they had enough. So about 50 barefooted Indians marched from Argyle Estate to Kingstown to protest the treatment that they were receiving. And as a result of that, the indenture system collapsed in St. Vincent. All of that we will have to bring in when we write our history of St. Vincent. So that's my brief comment right now, but just to say that there's a lot of gaps we have to fill in, and that's our job. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Thomas. Sister Musa, and then our dear sister.
I just want to raise one point. I mean, it's clear we're living in very exciting times. And I want to know what is happening in SDG to bring this history to the streets. Because we have tour guides who are giving tours, and some of that information is not correct, and that is very disturbing. So I want to know what action is being taken to bring it to the
Okay, thank you. Our sister from Suriname, sorry, I forgot the name.
I think I will have to put it on.
Was there? Okay. Yes. Good morning again. And let me start with this. When I was in school, my girlfriend, sat next to each other, called me an Indian, and I choked her. I almost choked her because I said, "No, I'm not an Indian. Haven't you?" The teacher told us Columbus misnamed the people they encountered. So I'm not an Indian. Call me as how my father told me my name is. So, question to the, thank you for the lectures, for the information, to the learned persons in our presence here. Well, yesterday in my presentation, I named the Western Hemisphere the world of indigenous people. I don't know if anyone captured that because we had a little technical problem, but that is how I name the Western Hemisphere. So, one good character humanly of white people is that they wrote and still they write down whatever they see. However, we come to understand that what you see, how you look at it, it's how you will put down what you have seen. So we know now that we have to make some correction in earlier writing, what we call history. And I think this is a good association with each other. So if history tells us that on 12 October 1492, one white man came to this part of the Western Hemisphere, and throughout history it is written about the only type of human being they have encountered were the Indians, as how Columbus named them. I never seen in history that they encountered some other human race other than what we know now as indigenous peoples. So with this, I want to ask the historian that when we write down now and trying, for example, that we writing down, we research, we do the writing in order to teach our children and others see almost the truth. Let's do it fairly, very clearly, so that we can use, not to say that is truth, but we can never be the truth at one point because we are still searching. But let's put a point where we say, yes, that is how we encounter that, because we need archaeological fund, research and whatever research to complete an ID. Let's do that. That is one. About this, what was indeed that point? And secondly, with regard to the history of the Caribbean, Suriname is part of the Caribbean at the point and part of South America. And from 1492, you know, the spreading began since then, everywhere. So we all have a common history. So my request to the historian, if you're busy with St. Vincent and the Grenadine, and you come across history that relates to Suriname, for example, and we are there, not too far from you, but we don't have the opportunity to do that research, at some point, maybe through a forum like this, that we share this information with each other, because it is necessary that we also, because we are trying also to find a link where what we can use in history. So we all are researching, and even with the how do you call that, the intercultural education process of teaching our children our heritage or our history through our heritage, we are also in that process. So if we share information, I think at one point we can come to indeed a good model for not only the teaching of our history, but anyway a foundation out of our own need and way of thinking and way of seeing our culture, that we start something to go on. Okay. That's what.
Okay, thank you very much. The panel, oh, sorry, Vanessa, oh my dear. Vanessa, and then we'll ask the panel to do a quick response. Then we'll have to end this first session. Okay. Oh, sorry. 2 more questions, and then we'll end the session with the panel's response.
Good morning. I'd like to thank you as well for those presentations. Well, it's a panel that's very interesting for me. I was supposed to present this morning, and not from the answers, and I would like to bring in some comments if you allow me. Well, first, Dr. Fraser, Dr. Thomas, as Ronnie said, if you do need a feminine input into this historical book, I will be more than happy to bring mine. So concerning the questions regarding the African presence before, I share the opinion of Dr. Fraser that I do believe that there's been Africans coming here before. We cannot doubt the navigation and other skills of the African people to reach here before. However, I do not as well associate this presence with the origin of the Garifuna people. Concerning the teaching, do we have aspiring teachers in the community teaching?
Yeah, these are all teachers at the community college. Yeah.
We all agree that we do have a long way to go regarding the system, how things are taught, and what we teach. And the issue is that it's not just a national issue, so it's a process. However, I will say that I'm joining Sarah Lee when she said that we do have to not just involve the teachers of history or of social studies, because we can teach heritage and culture through many different subjects as well. I don't know if you've been to Petit Bordel Secondary School, but the kids have done a mural in front of their school, and it's very nice, and it's representing drums of our fathers. There's a lot of things that the kids have painted with students from the Richmond Vale Academy. And I'm sure that if you ask those kids about it, they'll be able to remember that for years, why they did it, how it happened, and where it's coming from. The Garifuna School Festival is another example, a very good example, where we have kids from primary school preparing dances and choral speeches and songs in Garifuna. Florida mentioned yesterday the work of Yoga Cure, where we're using drama and different ways to have the kids involved, and they will remember those things. So I think that we do have to use the practice too of go beyond textbooks, and also seek more help from the communities, as it was said. We need to bring the children in the communities, or even sometimes ask the community members to come in classrooms, which can maybe be easier if we cannot move the kids. There's definitely a need for the teachers to be involved and passionate about it. We know that it's not taught in school, so you have to get your own research on that, your own means to do it. But I'm working with a non-profit organization. When we have events, we get to, beg Gibson for paint, for this. Usually, people are quite cooperative. If it comes from a school and you ask them for resources, I'm sure that you will find ways on your own out of just waiting for the government to provide them for you. So there are many ways to do it. You just have to be a bit more creative to know how to engage. We've been mentioning as well apps yesterday, and the work of Ms. Nunez is excellent as well with crosswords, and she'll be telling us more about it this afternoon. But games, things like this are the best way to involve the students in that. So, and just the last thing I wanted to say is to come back on what Mr. Thomas said. When he said, I'm here because of the genocide and of what happened, I've got to exchange with Garifuna diaspora members that could tell me we are still here and alive, and the culture is still alive because we were banished. Because if we had stayed in St. Vincent, they would have just taken all of our culture and everything. We would not know today what happened and what is. So, sometimes there's nothing good in this story, but sometimes people get to find something positive in life. Yes,
All right, thank you, Vanessa. Sister Zola, quickly, please.
Yes, 2 points. One, a comment and a question.
Sure.
I think my comment relates to the issue of the CSEC curriculum, because I think it is a reflection of a broader issue that needs to be discussed, not necessarily at this forum, but which needs to be put out there on the table. in relation to the decision makers, who chooses these CSEC materials. And that's an issue that has political implications in the broader sense as to how decisions are made or have been made, maybe we just inherited certain systems that we ourselves are not questioning, and we're just implementing what we learned before in the terms of following the broader way how things are done. Just like I learned at some point in the past that the publishing houses, the bigger publishing houses are the bigger ones that publish our books, our textbooks. Heinemann and all those other big names, and how they get to select which writers write for them is a political decision. So I think there is much decisions, things that we need to question, but not at this point. But I think the issue of what goes into the CSEC curriculum is also a political question. And we have to challenge those political decisions and inform ourselves about them so that we can understand why we're having this discussion now. It is not by chance that those things happen. The second issue when I heard a history book of St. Vincent was being written, I was happy, excited, and then I started to question, or I said to myself, well, let us hear more. And I listened on the radio, and I listened, and I didn't hear anything. And then I said, oh, perhaps, because in my mind, that is also a political issue. What goes into the history of a country? We must understand that these things are dynamic. And so my question to the history writers would be, how much of this history do you perceive is going to be a work in progress? And how much, if any, consultation will be done with the public on the history book?
Thank you very much. Panelists, Dr. Fraser, Dr. Welsh, Dr. Finneran, Dr. Thomas.
I want, first of all, to just make a comment on the point that and question asked there, and to say that our colonial history started from 1492. When we were reading the books written by the colonial, it is as though nothing existed before. So you started at 1492. And we had an interesting case in St. Vincent where we grew up believing that Christopher Columbus discovered St. Vincent in 1498, only to find out that in 1498, when he was supposed to have discovered St. Vincent, he was in Spain. So we had for quite a long time that day, the 22nd of January, as a holiday. And I remember writing about it, and people objected. One gentleman said, I learned this in school. Who are you to tell me that this is not so? So that is one aspect of it. The other aspect is the aspect of discovery. Columbus could not have discovered people who existed the day before. And in fact, the indigenous people had a saying that they were the ones who discovered Columbus on the beaches. So we are moving away from that whole colonial thing to a different approach as independent people. And the point you're making about collaboration, in 1992, the indigenous people of the Caribbean came together with an organization called the Caribbean Organization of Indigenous People. And that would have been a very good vehicle to begin that kind of dialogue. And I agree with you that we still need to do that. At the moment, we all taken up with our individual histories, but at some point, because there's so much that might be similar about it, so what you're showing is a very important thing that we need to look at. In 1992, when you had the quincentennial of the arrival of Columbus, the indigenous people not only came together, but they started doing their own research and trying to revisit their history and to refine and re-identify themselves, not as seen by the colonial, but as seen by the people themselves. And that process is still going on. About the history, it's actually, it's a work in progress. The question of consultation with the public and so on, it doesn't give very much room to do that because there's a time limit on it. And but at some point, this needs to be done because in any event, there's a lot that would not be covered. You take, for instance, you take a question of indigenous resistance to European colonization. You might end up with one chapter of about 25 pages or 30 pages. So there's a lot that is going to be left out. And that is the kind of challenge you have trying to do that. It is, first of all, in 2 volumes, and you don't want to have a volume that is going to scare people away from reading it. Already we talk about people not wanting to read it. So it is really a very big question, and how we go about it is, but it is a start, and we have to find ways of continuing that. Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Could I just?
Sure.
I noticed that Camille has gone away, but she raised a point about the tour guides, and that is something that has concerned me. I do a session with tour guides from one particular company where we speak about, St. Vincent, the kind of attractions and so on. But when I look at some of the people and I hear people speak about what they were told, I have a lot of thoughts, a lot of questions. And I think we need to find a way of ensuring that there are sessions which could guide and inform these tour guides, because you don't want to have tour guides giving misinformation about the history of the country, and it's something we need to look into.
Okay, Dr. Finneran, any responses from the questions? Okay. Well, of course, we will have to cut you here. We have 3 more presentations that we need to get before midday. So I want to thank our panelists in this first session for the morning, Dr. Finneran, Dr. Welsh, and Dr. Adrian Fraser for their presentations, and of course, Dr. Thomas for his